Good afternoon. My name is Stephen Miles, and I'm the president of Win Without War. And today it's my distinct privilege to welcome you all to this exciting event. Can we make foreign policy work for the people? If you're joining us today, it's likely not news to you that US foreign policy status quo is deeply broken. For decades, we've pursued a war-first foreign policy that has left little but destruction and chaos in its wake. Meanwhile, people, both here in the United States and around the world, have seen the biggest threats to their actual security, threats like global pandemics, corruption-fueled income inequality, and a climate in crisis, go largely ignored by policymakers. It doesn't have to be this way. And today, we're here to say there is an alternative. In a moment, we'll be joined by Representatives Barbara Lee and Pramila Jayapal to offer their view on where we are and what we need to do to make foreign policy work for everyday people. We'll then turn to an expert panel that includes leading voices from veterans, women's and working class movements and faith perspectives. And be sure to stay until the end for a chance to hear how you can make your voice heard and take action for a new vision for US foreign policy. Feel free as we're going to ask any potential questions for the panelists in the comments where you're watching this stream. And feel free to lift up the event on social media using the hashtag FP4People. That's the number 4. Finally, before we get started, I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from the ancestral land of the Nacotchtank and Piscataway people and pay respect to their people, past, present, and future. Now, it's my true honor to hand things over for the rest of today to my good friend and Win Without War's new executive director, Sarah Hagdusti.
Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Sarah Hagdusti, the new executive director of Win Without War, and it is my absolute honor to be able to introduce two of the fiercest champions of progressive foreign policy in Congress. Today, we are joined by Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal of Washington, chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, and Congresswoman Barbara Lee of California, Chair Emeritus of the CPC, Chair of the CPC Peace and Security Task Force, and much more. Welcome, and thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you, Sarah. It's great to be here with my fearless leader colleague, Barbara Lee, and with all of you.
Sarah, let me thank you and Win Without War. Let me thank Stephen. Let me thank all of you for really being visionary and for leading on so many fronts. And of course, to my sister, Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, who has taken our Progressive Caucus to new heights. And I just wanted to say thank you to Congresswoman, Chairwoman Jayapal for what she has done in terms of her leadership with the Progressive Caucus and with the entire progressive movement in our country. So this is the time to talk about a new foreign policy for the 21st century. This is the moment, and we can't lose this moment. So thank you, Pramila, very much for your.
Absolutely. And for the entirety of your careers, you have both been some of the leading critics of the adversarial war-first approach to US foreign policy. Congresswoman Jayapal, what does that status quo look like, and what has it meant for the security of everyday people here and abroad?
Well, Sarah, again, it's just so exciting to be here with you, Win Without War, and all of the partners that are going to be on the panel later. And I will just say for anyone who doesn't know that Congresswoman Lee is one of the people that actually inspired me to run for Congress when she took that bold and courageous vote that we all remember very well back in 2001. And so this is I think a really important moment for us to look at what a visionary foreign policy looks like and what the status quo does not help us to get to. And I'll preface this by saying that I'm an immigrant. I was born in India. I grew up in India and Indonesia. I saw and worked in areas of tremendous conflict and refugee camps along the borders of Laos and Cambodia as people were fleeing from war, and also all over Africa and all over Asia. And so a lot of how I think about foreign policy is very much rooted in what it looks like around the world and how people see the United States and how we as a country should see ourselves in our own leadership. And to me, if you look at the last 2 decades, the United States has just continued to pursue a failed foreign policy that has cost countless lives and billions of dollars, all without making us any safer. even though it's implemented in the name of national security, we have to understand that all of that has not made us safer. Since 2015, defense spending in the United States has ballooned by more than $100 billion, while millions of Americans are struggling to make ends meet as they're burdened with debt, with skyrocketing housing costs, with exploitative jobs. And this is an adversarial and militaristic approach to foreign policy that is absolutely ill-suited to addressing the national security threats of our time. Things like Stephen had referred to, like economic inequality, climate change, the rise of authoritarianism at home and abroad, the proliferation of nuclear weapons, and a global pandemic that's prolonged by vaccine apartheid. So these challenges are not going to be addressed through punitive sanctions, through violence, and through isolation that only harm the people that are most vulnerable to start with. And that is why Representative Lee and I, Congresswoman Lee and I, are so excited to unveil a new vision, because I think we have been very much in the posture of saying, you know, these are the things we shouldn't do, but really being able to work with movement advocates, with all of you, with my colleagues in Congress, to come up with an actual progressive foreign policy vision for what we should be doing and what we can do, and how we would redirect the billions and even trillions of dollars that are spent on this old view of security, this militaristic adversarial approach. What would happen, and how do we envision the world differently if we can take those dollars and put them into a different way of interacting with the rest of the world, and also recognizing that the threats we face right here at home around inequality, the threats of climate change that drive migration, and that are an issue both in the sense of climate per se, but also in terms of human lives when you talk about immigration and refugees. So that is what we're excited to unveil today and have this conversation about. And just to put people in a new place of how we think about this new, exciting, visionary, effective foreign policy vision for this next century.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you for sharing your personal story as well. I know that as someone who was born in Iran, whose family was impacted by the Muslim ban, and as a woman of color, having people like the two of you as role models in this space and seeing your advocacy has been transformative to so many of us across the country. So thank you. And I know there are lots of people watching today whose families have probably been affected by this violent first approach to US foreign policy. And it can sometimes feel, when we're living in this broken status quo, that that's the only way, but it's not. There are different approaches, there are different solutions out there. And as Congresswoman Jayapal said, it is so exciting to be talking about a visionary new approach to foreign policy. Congresswoman Lee, what would an alternative foreign policy look like? One that's up to the security challenges we are facing today and that works for the needs of everyday people?
Sure. And let me just say thank you again and tell you a bit about my personal history also. My dad was a lieutenant colonel in the Army. He served 25 years. He served in World War II and in Korea. And in fact, I'm the former wife of a former airman, and I was in England and lived on a base for 2 years in the Air Force. And so I come from a military background and understand the impact of war and what militarism has done to families in our country, and understand also the need for a strong national security. That's a given. But I also know that we have misspent our tax dollars forever on a war first, military first strategy. And that has got to stop for many, many reasons. First of all, we don't need right now $740 billion to support a strong national defense in our budget. We know that there's close to $200 billion in waste, fraud, and abuse in the military budget. And we know that people in our own country are struggling just to survive. And we know that we need investments in climate initiatives, in housing, in healthcare, in all of the quality of life issues that we all deserve, that everyone deserves in our own country. And so we need, first of all, to have a national security strategy and foreign policy that recognizes a strong national security, recognizes we must support our troops, but also recognize that we have to ensure that we have a domestic national security, which involves economic security for everyone in our country. And so we have to, in many ways, reimagine, and this is what our resolution does, reimagine our national security strategy so that we can have a strategy that centers on, yes, diplomacy, human rights, equity, and justice. And I will say that I have a chance now. I serve on the Appropriations Committee, and I'm the chairperson of a subcommittee. It's called State and Foreign Operations Subcommittee. My budget is a budget that addresses human rights, diplomacy, development, famine relief, economic development, all of the issues, COVID, vaccines, healthcare, women's issues, you name it. And my budget is $62 billion, okay? $62 billion. The defense budget, the defense appropriation budget, guess what? Their budget is over $720 billion, $730 billion. And so you can see right there how out of balance our national security strategies are. We need to put more research, of course, in my budget, but this is just saying that it's a glaring example of how we misspend our tax dollars, when in fact, if we had 300 billion in our budget for a 21st century foreign policy, believe you me, we would be able to begin to address human rights, begin to address poverty elimination, begin to address all of the issues abroad in terms of our diplomacy and making sure that we engage in diplomacy before we pull the trigger. That should be the last resort. We need to end these endless wars. We need to use the resources that have been saved from Afghanistan into putting into our own domestic needs here at home. And so that's just an example of what we need to do and how we need to reimagine our foreign policy and our national security strategy. And so we're going to keep at it. And I think you see that we're with you and with everyone who is helping us with our resolution. We're building power on the outside to make sure that members of Congress understand that they're going to have to sooner rather than later, step up and support us so that we can create a better world, both here at home and abroad. And that's what it's about, a better world for everyone, because everyone deserves the quality of life as a human being on this planet to be able to live and take care of their families with dignity and with respect.
Absolutely. And I think the pandemic has been so key for so many people in really highlighting how unbalanced our priorities and our budget is. And what I love is what you just said, showcasing that by really reimagining foreign policy, we can not only tackle the big issues, but we can also create more resources to make sure that communities around this country who are struggling can get the support they deserve as well. Now, the vision you two have both outlined is incredibly exciting. And for what's fabulous is the two of you have always been visionaries, but have always been on the front lines in terms of taking action to change things as well. And just today, you've introduced a new bill called the Foreign Policy for the 21st Century Resolution. Congresswoman Jayapal, would you tell us a little bit about this resolution and what it does?
Yes, I can't wait. And I'm so grateful to my friend Barbara Lee for helping me to envision this, and for all of you for being a part of it, because I think it really was an exciting opportunity for us to detail this vision. And so this is a comprehensive, it lays out a comprehensive framework for a U.S. foreign policy that emphasizes statecraft and diplomacy over military intervention. It centers human rights, and it empowers the people who are most impacted by the national security threats that we face. So there are a couple of key things that I want to just highlight within the resolution. It is very comprehensive. But number one, it returns war-making power to Congress from the hands of the executive branch, which has taken enormous liberties to intervene militarily in other countries without congressional authorization or public debate. And I think we see this right now with the war in Yemen. And we have been pushing the Biden administration very hard on ending the humanitarian crisis that is happening in Yemen, where more than half of the population does not have access to food, and where we see a growing need and real crisis every single day. And we think that there are many things in here that essentially are military action that have not been approved by Congress. And so we really believe that war-making power needs to go back to Congress. Second, our resolution talks about something that Congresswoman Lee mentioned, which is cutting down on waste, fraud, and abuse in Pentagon spending. People should just understand that of that $730 billion budget annually that the Pentagon has, half of that goes to private contractors. And within that, it's really only 5 major contractors that are getting the majority of that money. And so I think when we think about Pentagon spending, it should not be for the goal of enriching the shareholders of some of the largest corporations in the world. It should be focusing on the kinds of things we've been talking about, the kinds of things that Congresswoman Lee has in her budget, but also the kinds of things that we're focusing on here in the resolution. Third, our resolution says we need to hold the United States, its adversaries, and its allies alike accountable to international law and limit arms sales to international bodies that are responsible for human rights abuses. Fourth, the resolution also calls for an end to broad punitive economic sanctions that punish everyday people for the transgressions of their leaders. This is a tactic that we have used in the United States way too often. We should have learned, in my opinion, that it only serves to alienate those citizens and drive them into the arms of their governments. We need to have different ways to engage other than economic sanctions, which the people at the top, by the way, are always going to be able to get around those sanctions and get what they need. It's the people at the bottom that are really going to be dramatically affected negatively. Finally, our resolution talks about promoting a more diverse and equitable national security workforce to ensure that U.S. foreign policy reflects the values of a broad array of communities. And I think that in this resolution, what we've tried to do is lay out a comprehensive framework with a number of key points and also emphasize the communities that are disproportionately affected. I know that MADRE is going to be on the panel later, and we have had so many conversations about what a feminist foreign policy looks like, because at the end of the day, we have to understand that it is women and children who are disproportionately affected by these military actions, interventions, and approaches. And so I think our resolution is really putting forward that vision and also laying down some building blocks of what it would take to achieve a truly visionary 21st century foreign policy resolution for justice and for peace and security in the world.
Well, thank you both for this incredibly comprehensive bill that you've outlined that really centers the dignity of people both here and abroad. The foreign policy for the 21st century resolution plants a flag in the ground and envisions a bold new vision for US foreign policy that's really exciting for so many of us. And while it's an amazing step forward, I know that introducing this bill is only one step. Congresswoman Lee, we would love to hear from you about what it would take for us to make this vision a reality.
Well, thank you again. And I think you all know what it's going to take. You're the best organizers. And my colleague, Congresswoman Jayapal, is an organizer personified as it relates to not only on the outside, but on the inside of Congress. And so it's about organizing. It's about making sure, for instance, our resolution talks about moving away from fossil fuels into developing a green economies throughout the world, and the impact of climate change on women and vulnerable populations. Well, who better in our country to organize around this resolution than our climate activists who are working with us on a Green New Deal? And so what we have to do is build out these alliances, organizations and individuals who are phenomenal in terms of our progressive domestic agenda need to be educated and brought into the coalition so that they can then begin to talk to members of Congress, not only about our domestic agenda in terms of our progressive priorities, but about our new foreign policy for a 21st century. And so Black Lives Matter, our Dreamers, we have our immigrant groups, we have groups all around the country who we just ask them to come in. We want to listen to them. We know that, again, young people, the planet is burning and young people want to engage, but they may not know how to engage on a resolution or on a legislative strategy. They may, but they've been, I see this as being too many silos at this point that we need to break down. And so I'm confident that we can get Black Lives Matter engaged. I'm confident that we can get our communities of color engaged. I'm confident. I'm looking at Rev Theoharis. We've got the Poor People's Campaign. We have millions of people who can come together to help us get this passed. And we have people who we just haven't asked to partner with us. So I'm really confident. We have the clergy. I mean, the clergy should be engaged in this every single day. And people who and organizations that perhaps we may or may not have connected with on all of the issues that we've been working with, that you've been working on with Win Without War for so many years now. And so I just think this gives us an opportunity. People understand that this country is on the brink in terms of our democracy, and we have to do everything we can do to protect our democracy, which again, very fragile. And that means that we have to engage politically with groups that we may or may not have engaged with before, just to move forward. And that involves domestic and foreign policy. We're a global family. The pandemic has shown what affects one affects all. And so this is the time to bring in new organizations, people who have not really focused on or been involved with our movements to end endless wars and for a new foreign policy, to bring them in now and strengthen our coalition. And let's organize. And then finally, I'll just say, we have to hold elected officials accountable. So we have to be very political with this. We have to let them know throughout the country, members of Congress, are you with us or not? It's that kind of moment we're in right now. This is a climate emergency. It's a humanitarian crisis around the world. We're living in a world pandemic. And so it's we don't have time to wait. So are you with us or not? And that's what we have to do.
Organize. We are definitely happy to answer that call. And I will remind everyone to please keep listening to the end of this. There is an incredible panel, and we'll also have some calls to action so that you can get organizing as soon as possible. Now, I could, for one, listen to you both all day, but I know your time is limited. So I just wanted to ask if either of you had any final comments for our audience today.
Well, Sarah, I would love to just say, Congresswoman Lee I couldn't say it any better than Congresswoman Lee just said it in terms of organizing. And so my belief is that what we do is we put out a vision. That's what the resolution is. We get as many members of Congress to sign on to it. We'll need your help for that. They need to hear from constituents that this is something that's important to you. And then we use that as an organizing tool to help educate people about how to talk about this, what the statistics are, because I think the vast majority of Americans are already with us, but continuing to educate people about, what are the actual statistics of Pentagon spending? What goes to these defense contractors? What is happening with the Yemeni population or other populations around the world that are suffering from economic sanctions? And as we do that education, we build the movement in the ways that Congresswoman Lee talked about. And I think that this is a vision. It is also a tool for organizing. It helps to keep the pressure on us in Congress to keep moving this forward, to try and have hearings around this. Of course, I know Congresswoman Lee is doing everything she can with her budget, and we're working very closely on things like global vaccine equity. But this is a good moment for this resolution because we're also in the week of Dr. King, and I will never forget Dr. King's Beyond Vietnam speech and the intersections that he outlined between the ways in which our economic system is rewarded by our militaristic interventions, the ways in which poverty is exacerbated by the choices we make on war and militarism. And I think that this is a really important time for us to renew that moral call. And I thank Rev Liz Theoharis and Bishop Barber for all of the work that the Poor People's Campaign is doing on this, because we shouldn't forget the words of Dr. King when he talked about the deadly Western arrogance in saying that we're on the side of the wealthy and the secure while we create a hell for the poor. And I think that those connections that people need to have so that they understand what it is in their lives that is being affected by our military postures is so important. So organize, organize, organize. We are all in it to really be able to bring justice to the world. The resolution is just the first step towards steering the United States to a more constructive approach to foreign policy, but it is possible. And never let anybody tell you that anything is impossible, because if politics is the art of the possible, then it is our job as activists to push the boundaries of what is seen as possible. That is never static. It is defined by what we do as a movement to move those boundaries and make the impossible possible. So thank you all so much for what you're doing. And thank you, Congresswoman Lee, for being such an inspiration to me and to so many others across the country, and for continuing to put your leadership into action every single day.
Thank you, Pramila, Congresswoman Jayapal, for that very brilliant closing and for your gracious remarks. And let me just say to you, you lifted up Dr. King, and I was thinking of Dr. King's speech, the exact one you referred to, where he said the three evils. This was at Riverside Church, the three evils facing America: poverty, militarism, and racism. Poverty, militarism, and racism. And here we are finally beginning to address this in a way that I think people are ready to understand very clearly. Also, if you remember in that speech, he also talked about the fact that the clergy, especially the Black clergy, were beginning to ostracize him because he was speaking about peace, using the peace world. He became a global leader. He started connecting our struggles here in America with the global struggle for peace. And so I would just suggest we start using peace, the P word. I always say we never talk about the P words, poverty and peace. But in our organizing, with this new foreign policy for 21st century, I think it's important to talk about the goal is peace, because we want peace in the world. And don't think that that's a Pollyannish goal. Some people say, okay, Barbara, you keep talking about peace and poverty. Fine, fine, fine. You're looking at the world through rose-colored glasses. No, peace is patriotic. And that's who we are. We're patriotic, and we want people, and we want the globe. We want everybody on this planet to live in peace, with justice, with equity, and to lead the type of lives that they so deserve as citizens of this planet, as global citizens. And that's what we have to communicate through our organizing and through this, that we all are citizens of this planet and deserve the benefits of it, and have to really reimagine and reshape what our foreign policy means in terms of our global context, as well as in terms of here at home. So thank you all again so much. Really good to see everybody, and look forward to another organizing effort with my colleague, Pramila Jayapal, and we're gonna do it. Thank you.
Amazing. Well, thank you again, Congresswoman Lee and Congresswoman Jayapal, for joining us today and reminding us that a different foreign policy is absolutely possible and is up to us to help create. And I just wanted to thank you, not just for today, but for all the work you do to shift the war first foreign policy status quo. We see that work. We are incredibly grateful for it. And our movement will have your backs and go out there and organize to help make this.
Sorry, let me just thank everybody. And you guys, because we got to keep hope alive. I want everyone to know, because of you and Win Without War and all of our phenomenal groups, we were able to get the repeal of the 2002 authorization to use force in the bill. We've got it in the Senate now, and we're hopeful we can get it in the omnibus. This has taken us, 15 years? But just know that we're making some progress. So we do have to really know that we can get there. And I'm just citing this AUMF as an example of all the phenomenal work that, if it hadn't been for you, we wouldn't be where we are now, the Senate with the repeal. So thank you again.
Thank you. And thank you so much for, again, that work is so much easier when we have such strong champions in Congress like the two of you and working together to make it possible. So thank you.
Thank you.
And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Kate Kizer, a leading foreign policy strategist, and she is going to moderate an incredible panel to talk more about progressive foreign policy. Over to you, Kate.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you so much to the Congresswomen and as well as their staff for that great discussion and for this important resolution. And also thank you to Win Without War, one of my alma maters, for hosting this important event today. As Sarah mentioned, my name is Kate Kizer, and I'm delighted to be facilitating our next discussion with a fabulous group of progressive foreign policy leaders about the vision laid out by Congresswoman Jayapal and Lee's new resolution. As the speakers are talking, please be sure to think of questions, drop in the chat, and we should have time at the end to go through some of them. To get started though, I wanted to mark real quickly at where we're at today. We face some of the gravest human security challenges that we've seen in a century. Indeed, this century, we're looking at climate crisis that could have meaningful impacts for long-term human survival. And just 5 years ago, this resolution that was introduced today would not have been possible. It wouldn't have been centerpiece legislation of one of the largest, most powerful caucuses in the House of Representatives. And it wouldn't be backed by so many different organizations working across a spectrum of issues, because they know that we are all stronger when everyone's boat rises. And that's why we know we want to build security and safety, not only for our communities here, but also the communities abroad that we know US policy inordinately impacts. And so based on this new global vision, we wanted to talk a little bit about what should change, what the US should do instead, get down a bit more into the nitty-gritty of why really everyday folks should care. I think there's, at least when you talk to policymakers in Washington, they're never convinced that anyone outside of Washington, DC cares about foreign policy. But I think when we're reaching nearly $1 trillion a year on an unaccountable government agency that's never been audited at the Pentagon, and spending almost $2 trillion over the next 30 years on modernizing our nuclear weapons arsenal, which experts say is unnecessary, we should be questioning how we define security in this moment of economic collapse, global pandemic, and climate crisis ultimately. And so with that, I'm excited that we will have somewhat of an uplifting conversation today. And I'm going to turn it over first to my colleague, Pam. Pam, you worked in the military intelligence, you've organized war-impacted communities, and now you're continuing to build political power as Director of Peace and Security Department at Working Families Party. In Washington, domestic and foreign policy are often completely separate conversations, as you know, as it can also be in movement organizing. With so many challenges at home, why is it important for progressives to have a global perspective?
Thanks. First, I can't say just what a dream today is. What a dream after so many times that particularly people in DC who fashion themselves experts on foreign policy and national security have told us that it can't be done, that we don't know better. And it is a dream that we are now here and have put this amazing resolution together with such champions, and in a moment where it's most needed. It is not a wish, it is a requirement that we move from a foreign policy and national security that is actually collective trauma embodied, that is death and destruction delivered, and move to something that actually addresses the things that we need. And all of us know intimately right now that we are in a hurricane of crises. And those hurricane of crises are global. Whether you are in Tennessee or California or Berlin, if you are in Ethiopia, if you are in China, all of us face a terrifying future that feels out of control, but actually is not. It's not out of control because the world's most powerful and wealthy government just chooses to continue on this path of destruction, right? And so we don't have to make that choice. It doesn't have to be that way anymore. And I think what Barbara Lee, Representative Lee said was so important. Peace is not passivity. Peace is about justice. And there has never been a more dire time for us to ensure that justice is global, that we ensure that we're not going to normalize death, that we're not going to just say, well, the US government created these drone strikes out of a trauma response and there's no accounting for it. Because at the end of the day, this is only further disintegrating our society by thinking that we can't have another way. And so a few reasons that progressives must, not can, but must actually think in a global sense is we are a global community. Oftentimes they want to say that we are few, but we are the many. We are the many. We are the working class. We are the multicultural. We are everywhere. And we also are not only here in the US. We have comrades and colleagues all over the globe that share our desire for a more whole, just, and peace-secured future. And so really just anyone watching, think about your own international connections, whether that's your family, your friends, whether you went to a university or a college perhaps that has those university ties. I went to a community college that, had me talking to other folks. And so it's important that all of us take stock in not only our relations here on this land, but think about other lands, regardless of borders and these things that they try to keep us separated by. And the last thing I'll say is, because I know there's a lot of amazing speakers, is a vision for a better world is nothing unless we organize for it. And the most important thing we must do right now is bring more people into this movement for a better world. And elected officials are not our saviors, and they are not our rulers. They are not our bosses. They are our representatives. And this resolution is one of the most important tools to make sure that elected officials in DC can no longer just say that they know better than us, that they have a different strategy. We know that this resolution is the path forward to a more comprehensive and better foreign policy that will make all of us safe. And so it is important that we ensure to use this resolution. I'm very curious to see who raises their hand very excitedly to make sure that we are putting climate change and human rights at the front of the agenda in a time of mass chaos and crisis. And it's important that all of us make sure and ask those electeds that represent us, are you with Barbara Lee? Are you with Representative Jayapal? Are you with the movement for human rights and dignity? It's time for us to either hold these folks accountable or get them out of office. And so the Working Families Party is working very hard to build that political power for the many, not the few. And it is important that we see that we will not win justice and dignity in the US alone. It will take a global movement for us to build that better world together. So thank you to Win Without War. This is our moment, the spiritual death that Dr. King warned us about. It is now our time for spiritual renewal. And that renewal comes in the shape of this resolution. And so thank you all, excited to organize with you.
Thank you, Pam. And that's a great segue to our next speaker, who is Reverend Liz Theoharis with the Poor People's Campaign. And with as co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, Reverend Liz, your organizing lifts up and seeks to empower some of the most vulnerable our society has left behind. In what ways would shifting our foreign policy approach affect the day-to-day realities of people in the United States?
Well, thanks so much for having me and for this powerful bill that's being introduced today. As Representative Lee and Representative Jayapal quoted Dr. King, I'm also thinking about that. Here we are honoring this great leader who said that war is the enemy of the poor. And he talked about how having poor Black and brown and white people from the United States being sent off all around the world to kill and fight poor Black and brown and white people was actually a cruel manipulation of the poor. We are, as we've heard already, living in the richest country, most powerful country in the world, and yet there are 140 million people who are poor and low income. We are debating right now whether the nation can afford to invest in childcare and healthcare expansion, living wage jobs, climate resilient infrastructure, and yet there's a complete bipartisan consensus that is being challenged, that is being rocked right now, that we can keep on funding these forever wars, that we can keep on putting money into the military. We spend 53 cents of every discretionary dollar on war and less than 15 cents on education and healthcare and anti-poverty programs combined. So what it would mean to actually take money out of military budgets, out of the Pentagon, and put it into communities in this country and around the world, and build up the infrastructure of our democracy, the infrastructure of roads and bridges, and also the infrastructure of people's daily lives, and have anti-poverty programs, universal healthcare programs, all kinds of investments that are about peace, that are about justice, that are about lifting from the bottom so that everybody can rise. That's what this legislation is about. That's what our movements are about, and that's what poor Black, poor white, poor Latino, poor Asian, poor Indigenous people, poor people from all across the country and all across the world need. It's very clear that to have Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema standing right now blocking key investments. It came out today, for instance, that 4 million children will fall below the poverty line this month alone because of supposed scarcity when it comes to programs of social and economic uplift, whether it's for people in the United States or across the world. But yet we keep on spending all this money, all of these resources, all of this time on military, and that changes as people come together like they are here together, as the Congresswoman introduced this powerful making the connections, showing that foreign policy matters to poor and low income people in this country and to everyone throughout the land. And so just excited to be able to organize together and work together with folks to be able to really unsettle this kind of complacency around militarism, military spending, and a foreign policy that is war first and not peace and justice first, which is what our communities are demanding and can have.
Thank you so much, Reverend. And now I'm going to turn it over to Diana Duarte at MADRE. Diana, as Director of Policy and Strategic Engagement at MADRE, you advocate for gender justice and feminism to inform U.S. foreign policy. Does this resolution articulate a feminist foreign policy? And how does that differ from the ways feminism has been misappropriated and abused in service of things like the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. And it's really an honor to be part of this important conversation. You can't tell by looking at me on the screen, but I'm almost 9 months pregnant. So if I might seem a little short of breath, it's not only because I'm really excited to be here with you all. I also bring that up because I've been thinking a lot about the future these days and the world that my children are going to grow up in, which has a lot to do with the progressive vision in this resolution that we're here to discuss. So to answer your question, in our work to advance a progressive and feminist foreign policy, we start from a fundamental premise, which is that we need to hit reset. We've been talking so far about a lot of the old and destructive assumptions that have driven too much of US foreign policy making for generations now. And these are assumptions about what makes policies realistic or effective, what makes us strong, what keeps us safe. And these are assumptions that suggest that we can only be strong through the threat or act of violence, that compromise is dangerous and that diplomacy makes us look weak, that our survival and security depend on dominating others, especially militarily. And meanwhile, our world is totally roiled by crises that reveal the failures in these assumptions and in our resulting policies. And these are crises that others have mentioned, like the climate crisis, the pandemic, authoritarianism, and more. And so the inability of too much of our policymaking establishment to confront the reality that there is no military solution to these proliferating crises, that inability is at its root gendered. It derives from a tendency to privilege policies that are coded as masculine, like war and aggression, and discount what is seen as feminine, like care and cooperation. Furthermore, our government's emphasis on military spending and war, as we've said, robs communities of funds that could provide healthcare, housing, and education. And these are desperately needed fundamentals of the care economy that feminists have long advocated for. So this means that our existing US foreign policy isn't just failing to address our needs and collective security, it's actually deepening the threats that we face. So a more feminist and progressive foreign policy would, end rampant Pentagon spending, armed attacks, and nuclear proliferation, recognizing that war, as the Representative Jayapal pointed out, has the most devastating impact on women, girls, and communities at the margins. In your question, you mentioned Afghanistan, which I think raises another important point, which is that we have to be wary of how feminist or human rights concerns can be conscripted into justifications for militarism. Over 20 years ago, Laura Bush argued for the war on Afghanistan by citing, quote, the rights and dignity of women. Then the US went on to devote over 1,000 times more to military spending than to women's rights efforts in Afghanistan. So a truly feminist approach to policy now would revolve around accountability, mobilizing to provide what resources and repair we know that we owe the people of Afghanistan. And progressives know that we have to be able to grapple with human rights abuses and humanitarian crises worldwide without this destructive default resort to military force and aggression, which we know works against and not for human rights. Progressive foreign policy offers a way forward to do this, especially when feminist principles can serve as vital guideposts. And since my time is short, I'll mention just one feminist principle in particular, which is the imperative to prioritize the voices of those most impacted, as this resolution recognizes. When we talk about building a foreign policy for the people, and also, by the people, we have to be vitally talking about people worldwide who are directly affected by those policies. So at MADRE, we partner with women who are working to secure their communities on the front lines of conflict. So I'm thinking about, for instance, our partner Jamila Afghani in Afghanistan, who advocates for peace and economic recovery. Or in Yemen, our partner Muna Lukman of Food for Humanity, who distributes humanitarian aid and organizes local communities for peace. Women in some of these most fragile contexts around the world are already mobilizing around community-driven solutions to violence. And so a pragmatic, feminist, and progressive approach requires that we build policies that follow their lead. And to realize this vision, we have to work together to build pressure, the kind of pressure that can open up doors. And that's why MADRE, along with the Grassroots Global Justice Alliance and Women Cross DMZ, we co-founded the Feminist Peace Initiative. We're not afraid of the P word, as Representative Lee was saying, the Feminist Peace Initiative to bring a feminist, peace-oriented US foreign policy to life by bridging across social movements and uplifting the voices of directly impacted women and communities of color at home and abroad. And we know that ultimately we have to build a constituency for a progressive feminist policy that holds enough leverage, which means enough people power to propel change. And we're excited to be doing this work with many of you. And thank you once again.
Thank you, Diana. It's very refreshing to hear in a conversation about foreign policy leverage being actually about people power and not about military power. That's spot on. And we'll move to our final speaker now. I'm very happy to introduce Tobita Chow, who is the Director of Justices Global. Toby, as Director of Justices Global, which is a project of People's Action, you've helped workers around the country and world build solidarity in the face of a global race to the bottom in wages and workers' rights. How do we remain strong defenders of human rights and advocates for the bold cooperation and collaboration where that's existentially necessary for things like climate that this resolution advocates for? But how do we do that without giving ground to hawks who use human rights to ultimately justify more wars?
Yeah, thanks, Kate, and thanks to Win Without War for organizing this event. It's a great honor to be part of this panel. Yeah, so the greatest threats to people in the United States are also threats to people around the world: climate change, pandemics, inequality, rising authoritarianism and nationalism. And these problems reveal to us that the destinies of working families here in the US are tied together with people all around the world. These are fundamentally global challenges, and in order to confront them, we need to work together as a global society. And that requires us here in the US to work towards building a more cooperative and egalitarian world in which wealth and power is more equally shared between countries. And this requires us to reject the policies of war and militarism that preserve a divided and unequal world. And that's what this new approach to foreign policy is all about. And this is a fundamental paradigm shift in US foreign policy that will also allow us to truly prioritize human rights in US foreign policy for the first time. But as you said, Kate, we should expect that many militarists will attack us and argue that by rejecting their pro-war agenda, we are betraying the cause of human rights. As others have said on this panel, we see that militaristic policies get justified in the name of national security, but at the same time, we see decades of failure of these policies to make us actually safer. And we need to understand that militarists play a very similar trick with concerns about human rights. The overriding purpose of militarism is to preserve US military and economic domination over the rest of the world. And as Diana just said, we see that human rights concerns get conscripted into this project that is about US power and not really about rights. Human rights concerns get used to paint this veneer of moral principle over a project that is about US power. And that project of US power, of preserving US military and economic domination, that is a project that regularly and predictably leads to violations of human rights, as Diana described in the case of the US war in Afghanistan. We can also see this playing out in militarist policies targeting countries like North Korea, Iran, Russia, and China. We can look at the violations of human rights that result from the sanctions on Iran. We can look at our alliances with governments that regularly abuse human rights in Saudi Arabia, Israel, India, the Philippines. All of this is in the name of preserving and projecting US power, and it is justified in the name of human rights, even though it regularly and predictably leads to violations of human rights. And I believe that right now, we have a historic opportunity to expose the fact that this project of US military and economic domination, this project of militarism and war making, which is sold to us under the banner of human rights, is fundamentally incompatible with human rights, that it regularly leads to violations of human rights, while also, of course, feeding authoritarianism and nationalism here in the US and violations of human rights here at home. So what we're looking at is an opportunity to create a foreign policy paradigm that truly prioritizes human rights, that can be truly consistent on issues of human rights. But this requires rejecting militarism and turning away from this project of US military and economic domination. And I think we have a historic opportunity to do that right now. So I'm excited for us all to be a part of this campaign.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Toby. And thank you all for sharing your thoughts. As usual, they were brilliant and very awe-inspiring. I wanted to actually ask each panelist the same question, because I think you'll all have a little bit of a different answer. And it's one that comes up a lot in organizing spaces when talking about foreign policy, in that the folks who are making foreign policy, the ones who are advocating for certain policies in Washington, they often treat foreign policy as a clinical exercise, one that's about experts debating policies, what will be most effective. But there's also an amount of gatekeeping that happens, that it's all very secretive, behind closed doors. And there's a sense that foreign policy and national security. You even had like Harry Truman say this when he was talking about the war in Korea at one point, that it shouldn't be touched by harmful influence of everyday people, right? Foreign policy, quote unquote, isn't political. Well, we know that's not true. But as a result of that gatekeeping, I think we've had distinct impacts across the board, whether it's working on issues or the impacts on various communities that we work with and seek to empower. So I wanted to ask all of our panelists, what do you think about the effects of this approach in DC and thinking about crafting foreign policy? And how would a foreign policy made by and for the people differ? Does anyone want to just jump in, or I can volunteer someone as well?
I'm happy to jump in. This is something that is really at the heart of a lot of our work to push for a feminist foreign policy, because, you know, it's like that old feminist saying goes, the personal is political. The impacts of policies that, you know, may seem like, you know, it's just words on a page, but then when they're implemented here at home and around the world, have life-changing and too often devastating impacts on communities and in, you know, a lot of the women and families that we partner with around the world. So to my mind, it's a matter of justice, that people have a right to speak out on and have influence over policies that are affecting them. But it's also a matter of pragmatism and effectiveness. We can't possibly hope to have the kind of foreign policy that will work, that will promote safety and security and well-being for people here in the US and around the world, without the voices of those directly impacted around the table. Because, you know, time and time again, we've seen that's what leads us to, you know, unveil the true impacts of those policies, unveil the changes that are needed, is when those voices are you know, in the room. And I'm thinking also as well about something that somebody said earlier about this notion that people in this country don't care about foreign policy, that it's something outside the realm of relevance in their lives. And we've just found that that's not true, you know, that there are so many people in this country who do very much care about the impacts of foreign policy right here at home, of a militarist foreign policy, what it does to communities, including communities of color here at home. I'm thinking also about the many, many diaspora communities, you know, here on this call, and people who may be, you know, listening in, who know the impacts, who feel it very directly. If, you know, people who are coming from Iran, from Korea, from so many countries around the world who've been so directly impacted by US foreign policy, and they're here in this country and they want to hold our representatives and leaders accountable. I think this resolution is one way to go about it. But, you know, at the end of the day, foreign policy, any policy, is about people and people's lives. So that's my off the bat answer to that.
Absolutely. Pam, I think we'll go over to you and then to Toby.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the elephant in the room is that the line of thinking that you just said, the dominant thinking in foreign policy and national security, is inherently racist, elitist, and gaslighting. You know, when I was in the military, I was an intelligence analyst, and I learned a lot of things. But one of the biggest things was this war I felt in my body, where as a person of Central American indigenous roots, I was in a uniform. And at times there was this cognitive dissonance where I was like, are we on the same team, or do you generalize people like me to be the enemy? And I think it's really scary to say that out loud, but it was my experience and the experience of many that I have organized with. And, you know, the hard reality is that even in the progressive space, right, we still have a lot of work to do around understanding white supremacy as a baseline for the institutions that we say that we want to change. And so it is more important than ever, right, that we not just put people of color, you know, as Secretary of Defense and like call it good, but it's actually incredibly important that we understand that war affected people, war survivors, refugees, these are the people that actually need to be in charge of allocating money for security, because they actually understand and are products of a failed foreign policy from the United States government, right? And that is how we're going to reset. That is how we're going to overturn the tide, is by actually sharing power. And the foreign policy space is one of the most, it's so insular and small and a high concentration of power with very few people. The fact that we still have engineers of the global war on terror in our law and, in our law schools and universities, and that's normal. That's not normal, right? War criminality in government, saying and being the architects, is an issue. And it's actually fundamentally creating the insecurity that we're living in. And so it's important. And the hardest part is that we often think of white supremacy as like the white hat, violence. But I myself have experienced a lot of benevolent racism and supremacy and conquest mentality, right? And so it's hard to participate in a space like that. And we do need to think about new institutions as we dismantle institutions like the Department of Homeland Security. It shouldn't be in existence. Melt that down so we can build something that is cooperative and actually delivers relief to people here and everywhere. The fascists have no small imaginations. Those of us that are dreaming of freedom and justice should have no small imaginations either. And we shouldn't let people who are malpracticing and mediocre continue to allow us to tell us we can't.
Hear, hear. Toby?
Yeah, I want to underline this point about the impacts on diaspora communities and people of color. Much of my work has been on the intersection between these growing China threat narratives that have been promoted by the foreign policy establishment in the past few years and the recent rise in anti-Asian racism. Professor Russell Jung, who founded the Stop API Hate project, has a really good quote about this. He says, "When America China bashes, then Chinese get bashed, and so do those who look Chinese. American foreign policy in Asia is American domestic policy for Asians." And that's nothing new. We saw similar impacts with Islamophobia in the war on terror, and then we can go back further than that to the Vietnam War, the Korean War. But this isn't just about the impacts on our particular communities. This leads to political problems that then affect everybody. I think it's very clear that is the fostering of Islamophobia throughout the U.S. political culture under the war on terror was one of the major factors that fed the rise of Trump in the movement that brought Trump to power, which impacts the entire country, not just the direct victims of Islamophobia. Even before that, the scholar Kathleen Bellew has argued that the racism that was fostered during the Vietnam War was a critical factor in the rise of the white power movement in the 70s and 80s, which the current Trumpist vanguard is a descendant of that earlier white power movement. And I think we are going to see a very similar impact today of how anti-Chinese, anti-Asian racism is getting weaponized above all by reactionary, authoritarian right-wing movements as part of their plan to build and build power and take power in this country. So I think that's one very dire consequence of this pattern in establishment foreign policy that you've described.
Thank you, Toby. Rev Liz, over to you.
Yeah, so I think it's really important if we're going to be talking about challenging this kind of war first, military first foreign policy, then we have to challenge the kind of whole narrative that makes it possible. And part of that narrative is that poor people and people of color and others, regular people, women, queer people, aren't able to understand the complexity of foreign policy, aren't able to come up with comprehensive solutions to these issues when it's exactly the folks that are in charge who are putting forward this war first, this military first foreign policy that are not the most impacted, like Diana was talking about, who if we were to lean back and hear what is the reality of someone who goes and signs up for the military because there might not be a draft, but there is a poverty draft in this country, or someone whose family cannot visit them because of unjust immigration policies, or because of the violence, the Islamophobia, the anti-Asian violence that is happening because of what's happening all around the world. Instead, if we come up with the solutions, which are there and they're within reach, and they're human rights and people first and planet first solutions, this would actually really kind of transform our foreign policy from the bottom up, and it would make the world safer and more secure. It would help the planet, and people would experience, a better economy, more democratic processes across our country and world, and it would really shift things. And so shifting who gets to have a say in what is foreign policy and what foreign policy should be is a key part. And that's why we have to listen to the words that we must organize, because it's going to be people coming together. And if we had listened to the people, the United States would have not gone to war in Iraq. If we had listened to the people, we wouldn't have the level of violence and war across the world. It's because we actually have separated foreign policy from the will of the polis, the people, that we are in the situation that we're in.
Thank you so much, Reverend. Couldn't have said it better myself. And before we turn it over to Amisha, who's going to talk us through how we can take action to support the Congresswomen's efforts, I just wanted to ask our panelists if they had any final closing remarks they wanted to leave our partners with.
Sure, I can jump in with some closing remarks. One thing that really strikes me is that what we're trying to change here is so basic and elemental and fundamental. But if we are able to make some of these changes about who's in the room and what values are guiding our foreign policy in this progressive and feminist direction, it would be truly transformational. We would be living in a world unlike we've ever seen before. And so there's a lot of excitement that I think goes along with that, but really an incredible sense of urgency, because of the crises that we're talking about, whether war, militarism, the climate crisis, are truly life and death for so many millions and millions around the world. And so we need to figure out this path forward. And I'm really heartened by this conversation today to really see how all of us are coming together to make this basic but transformational change.
My last remarks are just, we can do this. We must do this. This is our time. No more sending our young into wars that they were never meant to be in. I want to live. I want to have a full life. And I think we can all do this together. But the moment is here. We just need to collect these members of Congress to actually move in the direction they need to go. So let's do it.
I just want to voice some appreciation for Representative Jayapal and Representative Liz. The thing that was introduced today, legislation that was introduced today, because this alternative to what we have now, that defunds the military, that invests in the things that matter, that says we can have a human rights kind of policy that can guide us, is the kind of visionary leadership that we need, and that's what people out in the streets are fighting for, and will continue to until we win.
Yeah, I do think this is our moment, and this is an entirely new kind of effort. And we were talking just now about how thoroughly undemocratic foreign policy is here in the United States, and that's part of the problem. But that's also like a real vulnerability for them. I think most of the foreign policy establishment is just not ready for the kinds of critiques and the kind of power that we are going to build. They're just not used to dealing with that kind of pushback that is backed by real power. So this is a real opportunity for us. So let's do it.
Thank you all, and thank you all for staying with us and being here and sharing your thoughts. I know I couldn't be in this work without anyone on this call being there, so thank you for participating, and thank you again to Win Without War and to Congresswoman Jayapal and Barbara Lee. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Amisha, who is going to share how everyday folks and activists can impact our broken foreign policy status quo. Amisha.
Thank you, Kate. I'm Amisha, the Senior Policy Associate at Win Without War. So today you've heard that there is an alternative to the militaristic status quo, and that we can create a foreign policy that actually centers people, not profits. But as the Congresswoman and our panelists said, to do so, we need to get organizing. We need to bring people into our movement, and we need to hold our elected officials accountable. The visionary foreign policy resolution that the representatives introduced is actually just the beginning of this conversation. Next, we need to unite people around this bill and build power so that our progressive solutions can't be ignored. Because, the reality is this isn't just a vision for the world that we want, it's actually the world that we're going to need this century. And you as activists are absolutely critical in making this future a reality. So what can you do right now? The first step is to let your members of Congress know how important this bill is to you and urge them to co-sponsor it. So on the screen right now, you should see a link for our petition. If you go to tinyurl.com/FP4people, again, that's tinyurl.com/FP4, that's the number 4 people, you can sign our petition, which urges Congress to pass the Foreign Policy for the 21st Century resolution. And you can also find the action on our website, on our Twitter, which is @WinWithoutWar, and on our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/WinWithoutWar. We'll also be sending out an email this week with the petition, so if you're not already subscribed to our email list, you can do so on our website, which is winwithoutwar.org. And, I know you're all here today because you care about building a world where there is security, justice, and equality for all people. So I really hope that you will sign our petition and make sure that your representatives hear from you. Finally, I want to say thank you to Representatives Jayapal and Lee for being with us today and for continuing to be fierce champions of progressive foreign policy in Congress. Thank you to our incredible panel of experts and moderators for their passion and vision, and to ACTV for making this all possible. And finally, thank you to you, our audience, for listening in and for helping us build the world that we need. So with that, I will close out this webinar. Have a great day.